Hello, Galesburg Catholic community. This is Daniel Dionysotis again, the seminarian in residence. Father Brokaw and Father Rose and I were talking about some things that I can do while I was here, and one of the things that came up is starting a saint series where each week I give a brief bio and brief reflection on a life of a saint whose feast day is this week. So this is the inaugural video of the Saint of the Week reflection and bio. And today we'll be talking about St. John of the Cross. Now, St. John of the Cross's feast day was actually Monday, December 14th, but today we're going to be talking about him, and he is the patron saint of contemplatives, mystics, and Spanish poets. And he's actually named a doctor of the church, meaning that he wrote profound truths about the Catholic faith. Particularly for John of the Cross, it's his spiritual theology. Now, John was born in the year 1542 in Spain to very poor parents in a very poor living situation. And his parents were silk weavers, and by the time John was 2, his dad had actually passed away. So his mother sent him to a school for orphans and poor children in central Spain, and it was there that John really distinguished himself as a tremendous student, and he excelled in his studies and made a name for himself there. When he was 21 years old, John of the Cross entered the Carmelites. Now, this was much to the surprise of his family and those who were around him, because the Carmelites weren't well-to-do and they weren't going to help his family get out of poverty. But John was very attracted to their spirit of silence and contemplation, as well as their tremendous devotion to Mary. And that was why John entered the Carmelites, for that spirit of silence. However, the Carmelites quickly sent him to university to get his studies, and it was there that John further distinguished himself as an amazing student. He excelled in his studies and was ranked top of his class. However, there was a certain dissatisfaction in John during his time at the university, because he still desired that time for silent prayer, and he really desired contemplative prayer and that silent spirit. And so he decided, when he was 25 years old, that he was going to join the Carthusians, which is an order that has absolute silence, and they almost live as hermits. They live usually very secluded from the world, and they live total silence with almost 24/7 prayer, essentially. However, when John was 25, he had a chance encounter with another great Spanish saint who's also a Carmelite, named St. Teresa of Avila. And it was during this encounter that St. Teresa recruited John to help her reform the Carmelite order. And she recruited John to help reform the men's group, the men's side of the Carmelites. And John immediately was attracted to this idea and was immediately taken up with it. So St. Teresa sent him to this house, very small, dilapidated house, where him and 2 other of his Carmelite brothers would begin the reform of the men's side of the Carmelites. And St. Teresa even felt that the living situation of the house that John was moving into was unlivable. She thought that John wouldn't last, nor would his companions. However, John seemed to surprise everyone because his great spirit of poverty, his great love for penance and mortification, and his unfailing love for God actually ended up making this Carmelite order in this house thrive. In this living situation that seemed to be unlivable, John seemed to live best in that. And St. Teresa began to notice within him outstanding holiness and outstanding virtue. So she asked him to come back to Avila to be a confessor and spiritual director for her nuns there. And for the next 5 years, John was their spiritual director and confessor. Now, for all of John's life, he became known as a spiritual director because he had tremendous insight into the spiritual life, but he also was very well educated. So he knew theology really well, he knew psychology really well, and he knew the way God works in a soul through his own experience. And John's spiritual direction would become one of the things he's most famous for and would overflow into his writings. Now, there are 2 events in John's life that I want to talk about. 2 events that I think highlight best his love for suffering, but also the suffering that happened to him in his life, and how through all of these dramatic events, John always remained in a spirit of trust in God, because he saw God's hand in these traumatic and difficult moments of his life. So the first moment I want to talk about is when John was 35 years old, there were a lot of people who were jealous and antagonistic toward the Carmelite reform, especially Carmelites who weren't a part of the reform. So John's 35 years old, and a group of Carmelites, as well as peasants and soldiers, went and captured John and imprisoned him in a Carmelite monastery in this tiny, damp cell with only a slit in the high ceiling to let in light and airflow. And John had ragged clothing, and he had his breviary, and that was it. He was almost starved to death. He had very little water and was beaten regularly. And this all happened for 9 months. And this was an incredibly physically painful experience. However, for John, spiritually, it provided a tremendous opportunity for growth. Again, John had that spirit for poverty and that spirit of suffering that he would always unite with God and with Christ, specifically his suffering on the cross. And it was during this time of imprisonment that John ended up writing a lot of his most beautiful spiritual poetry that he composed in his mind and would later write down when he had the opportunity. So you can see in this moment where John on the cross is stripped of all earthly comforts, he's able to find solace and find joy and happiness in God alone. And that would influence his spiritual theology, as we'll see a little bit later. Now, the last event I want to talk about is at the very end of John's life. He's in his late 40s at this point. And there was someone who, in the Carmelite order, who became his superior, but was very antagonistic towards the reform and made life very difficult for John, and ended up actually sending him to a monastery that was very poor and very isolated in southern Spain. So John obediently followed orders and went to this monastery where he encountered tremendous poverty and isolation. However, his superior didn't count on John being incredibly holy and being a saint. So John thrived there. One, because he saw the hand in God in everything, and he knew that God's providence was protecting him even there. But two, he already had a love for poverty and a love for silence that suited him very well there with his Carmelite community. However, it was at this time that John developed an illness in his leg that spread throughout the rest of his body, caused tremendous suffering and pain, and he knew that he needed to go get help at a monastery close by that had more resources. So he went and journeyed on foot to this monastery, and when he arrived there, the prior, or the monk who was in charge, actually rejected him, saying that this sick monk would become a nuisance for the rest of the community. So John, just like before, was rejected by his own Carmelite brothers, was discarded as nothing more than a nuisance, and was treated very poorly. However, John knew that he was at the end of his life, and he knew he needed care. So he called on the prior, the head monk, one more time, and he begged his forgiveness for any trouble that John had caused him. And this had caused the monk to have an incredible conversion, because he saw John's act of humility, and he saw that, in light of that humility, his own sin. So this monk took John in, and all the monks cared for him until the very end of his life. And it was when John died that he had 3 wishes that he had made earlier in his life. 3 prayers to God were fulfilled. And these 3 wishes speak to John's simplicity and love for poverty. The first wish is that John wished to die not as a superior, but as a simple brother, monk, priest. He also wished to die surrounded by people he had never met and people who didn't know him. So he wished to die in anonymity. He wished to die as an unknown. And thirdly, he wished to die after suffering much, which he did through the rejection by his brother monks, but also the pain of his own illness. John had all these 3 wishes fulfilled when he died, which just shows his tremendous holiness and his tremendous love for God alone, with no attachment to this world. Lastly, I want to talk about John's spirituality and his spiritual theology, and I want to focus on one point. There's many points we could talk about, and there could be an entire course on the spiritual theology of John of the Cross, but I'm just going to focus on this one point that I think is rather foundational, and I think is really important for us that we can take away from his teachings and his writings. And that is that John repeatedly taught that we must detach our wills, our desires, any attachment we have away from earthly things so that we can love, honor, and serve God alone. And that can most easily be seen in John's imprisonment in that dark cell where he had nothing except for prayer. He had no earthly comforts. He just had God alone. Now, we all don't need to go and strip ourselves of all of the worldly things we have or all earthly possessions A lot of times we need those things. However, it's the spirit of poverty. It's the attachment of our wills to the things of this earth that John of the Cross says we need to get rid of. So another way to put that is that the soul must empty itself of self in order to be filled with God. I'm going to say that one more time. The soul must empty itself of self in order to be filled with God. If we're filled with attachments to worldly things, things that are not God, there is no room for God to lead our soul to perfection, to union with Him. But it's only through detachment, it's only by letting go of our worldly desires and our worldly attachments that our souls can be lifted up by God in pure faith to the perfection of heaven and the perfection of the gift of Jesus Christ and the gift of the Holy Spirit in our souls. So we should daily pray to God and pray for the intercession of St. John of the Cross that we may become more detached from the things of this world and that we can find joy and freedom in God alone. St. John of the Cross, pray for us.